My name is Myra Wallace, and once again I welcome you to Music for the Lunch Bunch. We are funded by the grassroots programs of the Johnston County Arts Council and the North Carolina Arts Council. Because this summer's program is online at YouTube and Facebook, I can't stand at the back of the room to collect your generous contributions. You are welcome to contribute to us, however, by mailing a check to the Johnston County Arts Council, Post Office Box 2019, Smithfield. Mary D. Williams, an Afro-American historian and gospel performer for over 20 years, sings and shares narratives of the Black South. She has traveled to more than 40 colleges and universities, more than 30 public schools, over 100 churches, a dozen libraries, and 7 public school teachers' institutes, several of them for week-long training sessions for teachers. She, along with friend and colleague Dr. Timothy B. Tyson, the author of Blood Done Sign My Name, has taught a community-based college course, The South in Black and White, History, Culture, and Politics in the 20th Century South, 6 times to roughly 1,025 students. Several semesters the course has been taught at the Hayti Heritage Center in Durham for undergraduates from North Carolina Central University, Duke University, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Mary has truly developed into a public educator studying North Carolina history and culture in Dr. Tyson's graduate seminars at Duke, and has been doing scholarly explorations of history and theory of gospel music with Professor Jerma Jackson at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She graduated in 2016 from UNC with a major in American Studies and minors in African American diaspora and history. Her knowledge of the music and of the culture from which it emerged is not merely layman's learning and its experiential understanding, but rooted in serious scholarly work. It is her primary goal not to just perform the best traditions of North Carolina, but to dissect their subtleties in an accessible manner for a wide listening and learning audience. She has performed and provided her voice to soundtracks for the Hollywood movie directed by North Carolina's own Jeb Stuart, Blood Done Sign My Name, which was released February 2010, as well as for the television movie The Wronged Man. She starred with Mike Wiley, an African-American playwright and actor, in his play adaptation of Blood Done Sign My Name at the Schaefer Theater at Duke in November 2009. And she has been featured on Dick Gordon's show, The Story, on National Public Radio.
I wanna be ready. I want to be ready, children. I want to be ready to walk in Jerusalem just like John. I want to be ready. I want to be ready, children. I want to be ready to walk in Jerusalem just like John. The spirituals have lyrics that lay the burdens down by the riverside. These are songs that are built out of a desire and a heart for freedom. It is a way out of oppressive society. They are songs that testify. The separateness of the enslaved, they borrow from their African descent a worship style and a form that basically became self-reliant to worship in their own way of expressing themselves within an invisible church. They coped as best they could with the presence of slavery ever looming. The spirituals became adaptations of what they had heard, not read, but heard in biblical stories. It was a communal belief in the overthrow of power. The stories gave them the thought of freedom, the desire for freedom, even though they were unable to even vocalize their desires or even say the word. They were not able to beat drums. They had their invisible church where they would gather down in the Bush Harbor late in the midnight hour. And in those hours, they would sing these songs that were stirred up within them by the Bible stories. The thing about these songs were, as spirituals, they were songs that were not composed by a great orator. They were not written down. They were not lyrically sound, not necessarily even contextually sound, but they understood the meaning. Songs like, "Did my Lord deliver Daniel? Deliver Daniel. Deliver Daniel. Did my Lord, 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 Lord deliver Daniel, and why not every man? He delivered Daniel from the lion's den and Jonah from the belly of the whale. The Hebrew boys from the fiery furnace. Why not every man? Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Deliver Daniel. Deliver Daniel. Did my Lord deliver Daniel comes out of a narrative about facing a horrendous persecution while in exile under a king that was a foreign country. Now, Daniel, in this instrumental way of overthrow, he was basically using prayer as his weapon. Well, the slaves used songs as theirs. Daniel, in his circumstance, the king ruled against prayer, but Daniel continued to pray. But I recall, and as I read this and began to research, I began to think Daniel really was one of the first persons to act on civil disobedience that I'm aware of. He knew the penalty for violating this law and was thrown into prison or into the lion's den. But his response was faith and prayer. The enslaved used that story as it gave them the courage to understand the very lyrics. If God delivered Daniel, then why not every man? The children of a darker hue thought to themselves freedom, delivery from slavery. Over and over again, we see songs telling the story of freedom from injustice. We see reflections of oppressed communities, this fascination with this oppressed community, with the extraordinary means of God's rescuing an oppressed people. The lyrics, even in Daniel, in this spiritual Daniel, in the lion's den, also talks about 3 Hebrew boys, a fiery furnace. Why not every man? The lyrics reflect the social circumstance of African enslaved then and, as we look at our present situation, even now. The message of Daniel continues to be essential, an essential story derived from the Bible, and it was applied to their faith and to their belief. Why not every man? Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land, tell all Pharaohs to let my people go. When Israel was in Egypt land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand. Let my people go. This expectation that God would send a deliverer for this oppressed people. That is one of the reasons why Harriet Tubman was named Moses, because they were expecting God to send someone. We realize the spirituals were words of confrontation, words of conflict that were set to music, but some scholars call it slave talk. Slave talk masked in songs, allowing liberation to be more than something whispered among their own internal community of people. Ernest Bloch says, slave talk is the art of cursing and blessing the oppressor all at the same time. The masking or veiling of messages through songs was their strategy, similar to that even among soldiers. Soldiers preparing for war, they use codes and message plans and on how they're going to defeat their enemy. That's why the work songs and the different songs that were used were so vital. But they still use these songs that came up out of the Bible, specifically out of the Old Testament. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. The walls come tumbling down. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. The walls come tumbling down as soldiers marched and sang and worked and sang. The songs were masked or veiled in strategy as these soldiers that were represented in this story walked around the Jericho wall. Well, the ring shout and other symbolic things that came over from Africa with the enslaved were ways of still utilizing this particular spiritual. Go Down Moses, as I just gave you a little snippet of, this spiritual gives motives of liberation. Let my people go. Confrontation. Confrontation in the very midst of conflict. The revelation to believe that God would do for the slave what was done for the Israelites. The dynamics of confronting bondage with a call for freedom, revenge, and redemption. James H. Cone explains it as a resurrection event, meaning that it is God's liberating power that not only set the house of Israel free, but any and all enslaved beings can be delivered by the principalities from the principalities of the power by God. This power, this liberating power, that had been bondage for 430 years ended, and they walked out of slavery. These stories represented to the slave that they would be able to do the same. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. The water's being troubled. People walking across on dry land. Moses being that leader, and God setting the people free through the leader that he sends. The songs allow for freedom even in bondage. And that is something that needs to resonate within us. They had freedom in and on their minds. Even though they were considered babbling buffoons, even though they were considered ignorant, even though this people was considered a people that were nothing but chattel property, they had freedom on their minds. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Oh, hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Oh, hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Oh, my Lord, oh, my Lord, what shall I do? These songs were again placed in these moments where who's calling my name? This anticipatory summons. Who's calling me? Somebody's calling my name. Now, as this particular song transitioned orally throughout, and particularly the Black church, they would sing, somebody's calling my name. Oh, hush, hush. Somebody's calling my name. Oh, hush, hush. Somebody's calling my name. It must be Jesus. He's calling for me. As the song was passed on lyrically, it changed. Steal Away was also massed within the invisible church, having several meanings, but the song projects still this vision of freedom. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you moan. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you moan. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. One of these mornings bright and fair, I'm gonna take my wing and cleave to the air. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. A confrontation in the midst of conflict, but also there in this particular song, it is revenge. Revenge against the oppressor. Pharaoh's army got drowned. She saw the enslaved crossed over into a new land, away from oppression, away from destruction. Liberation is the primary objective in this particular song, literally with survival. But the recognition of humanity is birthed when they begin to understand that this is the human aspect of it. Pharaoh's army, the slaveholder, is drowned. When these songs are played in the context of history, they are done at a time of oppression, so much heartfelt pain, anxieties, all kinds of emotional experiences. And these songs and their characters, they have a plot, but most importantly, they had resolution of enslaved people being freed from bondage. The plot resolution between the protagonist and the antagonist is redemption. How a people were taken out of the clutches of the enemy and how a people were restored back to a community, to their own culture, how they maintained their own culture in the midst of oppression. They made extensive use of what came up out of them, moans and groans and words that could not be uttered. I often used to ask my grandmother, my grandparents lived in Smithfield, and I can remember growing up, they would come to town on Saturdays. We lived in Garner, but to visit my grandparents was a very big deal. And so when I would visit them, it was important for my grandmother to make sure that she showed me the best time. And although she could not drive, my grandfather would put me in the front seat. There were no safety belt laws, so it was cool. And I would sit between them, and we would ride into Smithfield. Well, at that time, there was a huge billboard as you entered into Smithfield that said, "Welcome to KKK country." Well, I didn't understand that at the time. I knew the sign was there, I could read it, but it wasn't until much later that my grandfather explained to me exactly what that meant. But when we talk about these expressions of moaning and groaning and words that could not be uttered, it takes me to when my grandmother went downtown and she took me into Belk. There was a Belk on the main street in Smithfield. And we walked in and she was very excited that we were going into the department store, we were going to do some shopping, and then we were going to get ice cream afterwards. That was the plan. But this particular day that I remember so well, when she walked in, there was a change in the atmosphere in terms of the sales clerks. My grandmother, being an older woman, when she walked in, she had me by the hand, and she was just browsing. We were browsing, and she looked at some shoes, and they said, "B, you touch it, you better buy it." Well, first of all, I didn't know anything about the Klan, didn't know anything about really what was going on, but I did know one thing. You don't call my grandma by her first name. So I knew that that was all off. And I understood now the dynamics of that because the disrespect, because she was an African-American woman. But when we left the store, she was a little bit embarrassed by that. She took me by as she held my hand a little bit tighter. And then instead of going to get ice cream, she decided that Granddaddy just take us back home. When we got to the house, she was telling me, "Well, we're going to do lunch here. You know, go ahead and get ready." But then she starts this, So I was stirring around the kitchen with my grandmother, waiting for the instructions. But I still wondered, what is that all about? I didn't understand what it meant. As I got older, and we would revisit this situation a number of times, but I think when she felt that I was old enough to understand, she explained to me about the prejudices and the white supremacy, not in those words, because those were years ago, and I don't even know if she understood what white supremacy was. But she did understand prejudice, and she did understand the disrespect based on the color of her skin. And she explained to me that sometimes when you moan, when you groan, the devil don't know what you're talking about. And I understood exactly what she meant. And then, of course, as my husband and I had children and some of the experiences that they have experienced and he, as an African-American man, has experienced, I understand about that groaning. I understand about that moaning, those words that cannot be uttered, but that come up out of an emotion that you need to release. So it was a way of sharing those feelings, those expressions. The laments that are in some of these songs express the deepest need or reflection of the totality of life. It is a description of shared realities, songs that epitomized what was going on in slavery. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone, way hoping that heavenly land soon will be done. Trouble troubles of this world, Lord, troubles of this world, well, how soon will be done with the troubles of this world. I'm going home to live. I'm going home to live. I'm going home to live with God. The song and the singer provided fuel for a very long and complicated journey. These songs were actually taken orally and passed on. I know that I learned them by listening to my grandmother, and a lot of African American children learned them the same way. These songs had meaning, and as they were passed on through years, even up through into the civil rights movement, the lyrical changes of the songs became quite apparent. One of the things, for an example, I'm on my way to Canaan land. I'm on my way to Canaan land. This particular song, Canaan land, we understand even during slavery, it had a twofold meaning. The first meaning was to move geographically. The slave was intentional about wanting to leave the South. So Canaan was that symbolism, or the word that symbolically represented Canada or going north. But during the civil rights movement, when this song was passed on, the lyrical change of Canaan became the word freedom. I'm on my way to freedom land. I'm on my way to freedom land. I'm on my way to freedom land. I'm on my way, praise God, to freedom land. Then it goes on to say, if you don't go, I'm going anyhow. The slaves, during the civil rights movement, this word freedom was documenting the period and the time in which they existed. There was no more geographical location in terms of movement. Now we're going to change our situation. We're going to change. That's why marching became so important. They took the same song, Wade in the Water, that I spoke of earlier. And in the movement, the NAACP, the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Martin Luther King Jr., the Freedom Singers, the Montgomery Singers, all of these singers used these songs as an implication. When they were using in Wilmington, when the beaches were segregated, they would stick their toes in on the side at the beach and sing Wade in the Water. Wade in the water, children. But during that time, the police were yelling obscenities while calling them Negroes, niggers, and other names. African Americans stood on the edge and sang, we're going to wade in the water, children, while the police carried them away. They made demands with the same songs that came up out of slavery. Yes, we want our freedom. Yes, we want our freedom, children. Yes, we want our freedom. We want our freedom, and we want it now. Over my head, I hear freedom in the air. Over my head, I hear freedom in the air. Over my head, I hear freedom in the air. There must be a God somewhere. Septima Clark, Diane Nash, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, and again, Martin Luther King Jr. John Lewis, Reverend Shuttlesworth. These people, first of all, we have to understand Martin Luther King could not be everywhere. That is why one of the things that I talk to as far as my students is important to understand and recognize that Martin Luther King was not everywhere. It was the people within their own communities that took this music and took to the streets. And they got together in churches and they came up with a plan as to what they were going to do and how they were going to strategize. And they marched and they sang. And they talked about freedom. They sang about freedom. Everything about them was about freedom within the circumstance, because what do they want? Equality and justice. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. Before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Vicious attack dogs, floods of water hoses with hydraulic force used to barricade them and their bodies, but didn't stop the song in their hearts. It gave them freedom in their minds when they were opposed by Bull Connor, Big Jesse, which is Jesse Helms' father, massacres, media outlets promoting the figure of the black man as a black brute beast, ravaging the souls of all the white women. These were just a few of the opposing forces that they had to combat. But yet they sang, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. We gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, walking up the freedom lane." In my closing, we've got the light of freedom and we've got to let it shine. No matter where they were, they would sing. We've got the light of freedom. We've got to let it shine. If I'm in Birmingham, I've got the light of freedom. I've got to let it shine. Everywhere I go, I've got to let it shine. Tell Chief Pritchett, we've got to let it shine. Singing in the streets, mass meetings, marches, protests, songs emerging from the connecting of a people who wanted to find a way to be a part of the movement and activism. It was a time of discovery as the African American clothed themselves in the armor of song. We are soldiers in the army. We have to fight, although we have to cry. We've got to hold up the bloodstained banner. Gotta hold it up, even if we die. John Lewis, U.S. representative, wrote, this was during the movement, he said his mother had wrote him a letter and said, "Get out of that movement." But he replied, "I can't." So he began to write her, and as he penned the letter, he said to his mother, he said, "I have acted according to my conviction and also my Christian conscience. I can do no less." Signed, John Lewis. As mass marches to mayor's offices, college students protesting police brutality, sounds familiar, they were confronted by so many opposing things, but they are still singing, "We shall not be moved." We're fighting for our freedom. We shall not be moved. The songs have crossed and continue to cross racial lines and denominations. Pete Seeger, in his attempt to notate a melody that he asked about by a woman in Selma, during the Selma March, and he was asking him, why don't you all write these down? And he was saying that she was saying, "Write them down." You can't write them down because they change, because it's improvisational. They change based on the time and the circumstance in which they were living. So he resigned himself to what his father told him when he was trying to kind of get some type of solidify how these songs kind of come up. And what he resigned himself to is what his father told him. He said, a folk song in a book is like a photograph of a bird in flight. So they have what some call religious circles. These songs have healing power. They have forgiveness. They have atonement. They have repentance. But they affect social justice. They are empowering and they ascribe to liberty and to justice. And the music of the spirituals influence blues, gospel, jazz, and believe it or not, even country music. Thank you so much.